Yo, what's up, Sci Fam? We need to title this page Inheritance and get it all ready to go as we learn about how alleles give us our traits that we inherit. So, this idea of inheritance, if we were to define it, we would say inheritance is essentially traits that are passed to the offspring or the babies from their parents. Now, how those traits get passed on from the parents to the offspring is through the fact that it's DNA. And that DNA is what holds our genetic code. So traits are DNA, genetic code, and it's that code, that DNA, that gets actually passed on, and it's that DNA that gives us our traits. So let's say we had two flowers. Let's say we have over here a red flower, and we're going to mate this red flower with a white flower. So we use that kind of X or that multiplication sign if two organisms are going to multiply. Now, what is that going to end up producing? Well, it's going to give us a flower, and you can see it here in the structure. And the flower is going to have some petals on it. And I wouldn't expect them to be green, even though I'm using the color green. But the offspring would probably be, yeah, that's right. It'd either be red, white, or maybe even a combination of the two, so maybe like pink. Because the offspring is going to be a combination or have a combination of traits that are related to the parents. So the offspring we would expect to be red, white, maybe even pink, but not orange or green or black or blue, etc. What I mean by this is that it's not going to have traits, the baby won't have traits that the parents don't have. So let's learn about why that is and how this all happens. So as you remember, one of the things that we've done so far is we've talked about karyotypes. And in a karyotype, you take two chromosomes that are the same size and shape, and you put them next to each other in order to get an idea of the biological sex of the child and to see if there's any genetic disorders. Well, if we look at just two of those chromosomes that are side by side, let's take a look at these ones that I've drawn. Well, the reason that there's two of them is because we get one from mom, and that has half of our genetic material. The other one we get from dad, and that has the other half of our genetic material in it. So let's say we're looking at one trait that's up here. And if we look at this one trait up here, let's say that this is for eye color. Well, in order to get our eye color, we're going to get a little bit of our genetic information from mom and a little bit from dad. It's going to interact with each other to give us whatever our trait ends up being. And so it's got to be, our eye color is going to end up being something similar to our mom's, our dad's, or maybe even a combination of the two. So my trait that we're looking at here is eye color. So in order to abbreviate this kind of section here on each of these chromosomes, we are going to say that mom gives us half and dad gives us half. And to kind of use or steal a math term, we're going to call these things like variables. But since it's genetic and it's not math, we're not going to call them variables. Instead, we'll call these alleles. So let's write here that each of our traits, each trait has two alleles. One from mom and one's going to come from dad. And those alleles can be found here on these chromosomes that match up or are the same size and shape. So let's further define this idea of alleles. Well, we use capital letters and lowercase letters. So the letter G is a good letter to use because the capital and lowercase are very different from each other. Some other good examples are like the letter T or the letter R. The letter A could work really well. The letter B could work really well as well, because the lowercase and capital are very different from each other. You wouldn't want to get them mixed up. So like a letter that would be really bad to use would be like Z or W or X, because even though one is smaller or taller, these ones don't really give the reader a good accurate understanding of the difference between those two. And so we want to use a capital letter or a lowercase. Now the capital letter G is going to represent something that we call the dominant trait. Or instead of trait, since it's not really the full trait, it's only one allele, this is the dominant allele. And the lowercase letter is referred to as the recessive allele. Okay, the reason that the capital is called the dominant allele is because the dominant allele will overpower the recessive allele if they're together. So let's say that the dominant allele, the capital letter, is going to code for black fur. And in this example, the lowercase allele, the recessive allele, is going to code for white fur. Okay. Well, let's say that we look at those two chromosomes, and the two chromosomes that are side by side are going to have that trait on them. And let's say that the one from mom and the one from dad are right next to each other. We can see that the mom is going to contribute a capital letter G for black fur. And let's say that the dad is also going to contribute a capital G for black fur. Well, this combination, the two-letter combination, is something that we call the genotype. And what it means, what genotype means, is the actual two-letter allele. Now remember, each letter, one letter came from mom, one letter came from dad. Those letters would be representations of these gene sections on the chromosomes. So if this baby was born with two dominant alleles, which are the two capitals, that would mean that there's two forces for black fur. So this baby would have black fur, and I know that because there's two dominant alleles. Remember, the dominant allele tells me that there's black fur. Well, how the actual trait is expressed, meaning like how we see it, is called the phenotype. So the genotype are the two alleles. The phenotype is what it would look like. All right. So what would be the other combinations? Well, maybe mom is going to contribute the capital G, and the dad is going to contribute a lowercase g. Well, in this case, since the capital is dominant, it will dominate over the lowercase. And even though this person has the allele for a white coat, the black coat allele will overpower it. And so this baby would also have black fur. The only other combination that could happen is that mom could have a lowercase or a recessive allele, and dad could have a recessive allele. That's also possible here. And in this case, since there's no dominant allele present, the only combination of fur would be white fur, because both recessive alleles are present here. So if there's only two letters, a capital and a lowercase, a dominant and a recessive, for a trait, which is true of traits, there can only be three different combinations of those alleles. You could either have two dominant alleles, two recessive alleles, or a dominant and a recessive allele. So when we look at two dominant alleles, this is something that we call homo for the same, homozygous. And since it's two dominant alleles, we would say this is homozygous dominant. That's how you describe these two allele combinations. Instead of saying capital G, we'd say homozygous dominant. And if we had two lowercase alleles, it's very similar. We'd still say it's homozygous because they're the same, but they're not dominant alleles, they're recessive alleles. So instead of saying I have two lowercase g's, I'd say homozygous recessive, meaning there's two lowercase or two recessive alleles. Now the funky one here, the capital and the lowercase, since those are different from each other, we would call this heterozygous. And heterozygous always means that there's two different ones. And so therefore, we don't need to say if it's dominant or recessive, because hetero means different, and so we know that there'd be one dominant and one recessive allele. So whenever we want to know what the traits are in an organism, we can look at their genotype if we have those two alleles to figure out their phenotype. Their phenotype is what we would see. The genotype are the letters, the variable letters that we use to represent the gene that's located on the chromosomes. All right, as we learn more and more about genotype and phenotype, we can start to unravel how parents can pass on certain traits to their offspring. And also we can determine the likelihood of that happening, aka the probability. I will see you in the next one.